Hello and welcome to the programme in which leading UK columnists discuss the week's news with foreign correspondents who write, blog, podcast and broadcast to audiences in their home countries from the Dateline London. 18 months after Margaret Thatcher first became Prime Minister, under fire even in her own party as 500,000 more people lost their jobs and facing calls for a policy U-turn, she delivered a speech that still defines her. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning. This week, the woman who would be her successor U-turned. America's third lady, Nancy Pelosi, did not, going ahead with a visit to Taiwan despite Chinese warnings beforehand and missiles after. Nor did the Bank of England U-turn going ahead with the half-point rise in interest rates the governor had said the bank was minded to impose, the largest single hike in a quarter of a century. Here to discuss all that are Mark Roche, an economist and journalist who was born in Belgium and writes from here for the French news magazine Le Point. Isabel Hilton, who's been a foreign correspondent and broadcaster. She founded China Dialogue, an independent organisation concerned with the environmental challenges facing that country. And with us in spirit, if not in person, because a family member has COVID, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. She was forced to flee her native Uganda by Idi Amin. The 50th anniversary of the expulsion of Asian Ugandans has been marked this week. Yasmin is now a British newspaper columnist. Welcome to all of you. Yasmin, it's lovely to see you, and I hope the family member gets better soon. Let's begin, Isabel, if we may, with China and the Nancy Pelosi visit. I'd say she's the first lady because I guess Mrs. Biden is the first lady and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is the second lady, but Nancy Pelosi is next in line. So she's quite an important figure.
She is.
Why this display of anger from China, which to many outside the region will see extraordinary overreaction, firing missiles left, right and centre?
Well, it's a display. There are some useful things about this display of anger. For Xi Jinping, it's very useful in advance of the party congress, 20th Party Congress coming up. He's, consolidating his position for a third term in office, and who knows what after that. It demonstrates to his home front that he is defending China's interest in a highly nationalist atmosphere that he has done a lot to create. So if you create a nationalist atmosphere, you have to live up to it. If you define the United States as your principal enemy and China's principal enemy, then you have to respond when something like this happens. And finally, if you want to intimidate the Taiwanese, putting effectively a military blockade around the island and constantly probing into the airspace and provoking, their defenders to have to respond, you test the defences, you intimidate the population, and you look like a big man in town.
Yasmin, Nancy Pelosi could be described as, kind of possibly on the way out. I mean, she could be Speaker for only a few months more if the predictions of the midterm elections are worth anything at this stage. It therefore seems a particularly dramatic response, and yet she was advised, we are told, at least by some in the Biden administration, not to go. Was it a misjudgment?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Isabel has said. But one question does remain: why? Why would you? The world is in such a precarious state at the moment. Why would you, Nancy Pelosi, whom I've always admired greatly? She was the State Department advised her apparently not to do this. What was the point? What was the purpose?
And particularly, Isabel, given that she's known as someone who Beijing really actively dislikes, because I think she turned up in Tiananmen Square not long after the massacre.
She did, holding a banner, commemorating the dead of Tiananmen Square. I mean, sadly, and like Yasmin, I have a lot of time for Nancy Pelosi, but it looks like she wanted a big finale to her career. She's not going to be Speaker after the midterms. She went on an Asian tour. It's not actually clear that the Taiwanese invited her, but they could hardly say no when she proposed coming. And it's not at all clear that they got very much out of this, except a lot of aggro and a lot of high attention from China. So I think it was, and sadly, a political misjudgment on her part.
Everybody gets an unwelcome house guest from time to time, Mark Roche. I guess you have to grin and bear it.
Yes, absolutely. But, it gives a fantastic opportunity to Xi Jinping to forget about the economic problem in the eye of the Chinese people by using this nationalistic, militaristic attitude, because China is on the brink of recession. because the COVID restriction and their obsession about confinement, but also the looming recession in the West, which is the principal client of Chinese goods. And so by doing that, he can avoid really focusing on the economy. I don't think China will go further than this saber rattling, because, you know, the West, I think, has an arm with the sanction. And I think the sanction on Russia do work. It's crippling the Russian economy. I don't think China wants that. So I think it'll finish. What is worrying is that forever there might be a blockade, but Isabel can correct me.
I'm not sure there'll be a blockade forever. However, they did declare before Pelosi's visit that they no longer considered the Straits international waters. Now, those are very important international waters. A great deal of shipping goes through them. And if China sticks to that, that's going to inconvenience the entire neighbourhood and, you know, international shipping as well as Taiwan. So there's a risk that things get ratcheted up and then, you know, certain things are not retreated from. The other great casualty of this, however, which I think is in a way almost more serious, is that they announced today that they are no longer going to cooperate on climate change with the United States.
Now, this was one of the big announcements at the
Today.
Glasgow summit, wasn't
Yes.
it? Out of the blue almost. It's obviously President Xi wasn't there. And the Americans suddenly announced they got this agreement.
Well, it was an announcement with Xi Jinping, who was the John Kerry equivalent,
Yeah.
and John Kerry, the climate envoy. And it was really the only bit of momentum in COP26, because, you know, and so many things have happened since then, the war and so on, that all those things that have been put off, if you like, and were meant to happen in COP27 this December, they're just, you know, it's looking very serious. And we have till 2030 to bend the curve on emissions. When the United States and China worked together, which was in the Obama Xi Jinping era, they essentially, you know, got Paris. That's how we got Paris, because they weren't fighting each other and they were mobilizing their respective, you know, allies and
this
friends.
was the Paris Climate Agreement, which we were trying to enforce.
Precisely. But now we need to ratchet up the ambition, and we need them working together on this.
Yasmin, this is the great dilemma anyway, and the American policymakers are wrestling with, and it's a terrible time before an election to wrestle with something like this. What sort of relationship can you have with China from the Washington perspective, and even from the perspective of other parts of the West, including its near neighbours like Australia?
I think we have to be very, very careful. I mean, I think I've often said that China's politics, not only around its neighborhood, but across Africa, South Asia, there's a lot going on there, which should worry us. But at the same time, I'm sorry, for 25 years longer, everywhere that the United States has gone in as a savior, it has left a place in total devastation. Think of Afghanistan, think of Libya. So the idea that the US is kind of the good player in this, I agree with Isabel. We are in such a bad place with climate change. This is not the time to start playground fights. We have to cooperate, the whole world, if we are going to save the planet. And I just don't understand this visit. I don't understand the rhetoric. I don't understand China's kind of war games when the world is in such a crisis. I really don't.
Just it raises an interesting question, which is about the status of Taiwan, Yasmin, in terms of how it is treated. I mean, I'll get Isabel to give us a bit of context in terms of the history, but in terms of, I mean, there are a lot of people kind of pussyfoot around this. Is Taiwan a country? Can we offend Beijing by describing it as a country? Should we recognise all the rest of it? And that, in a sense, is one of the added complications here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, there is this far bigger picture too. And Taiwan is actually flourishing for a while. And after what happened to Hong Kong, I would not underestimate the fear they feel.
Now, that's really interesting what you say about Hong Kong, Mark, because you could argue that one thing that has changed and which might justify America taking a more combative approach over Taiwan, is what China has done in Hong Kong. It's change of approach. I mean, I was talking to Victor Gao this week who was saying, no, it's just a continuity. There's always been a national security law. The British had a national security law. Well, it clearly wasn't like the national security law. And you can criticise the British for lots of things. There was clearly not democracy in Hong Kong before the handover. They were moving towards some sort of elective process, but it hadn't been really on the agenda quite late on. But it clearly wasn't the Hong Kong under the British, and what China is now doing. It's not even what China was doing 10 years ago. That has changed the calculation in terms of Taiwan.
Oh, completely, because no one believed China, and they would do to Taiwan if they occupy it, which I don't think they will, because first the Taiwanese military is quite strong. It has very advanced military equipment from the US, and also the latest war waged by China in '79 against Vietnam was a resounding defeat. So we are not sure about the preparedness and how good they are. But Hong Kong is a real warning that China is an authoritarian regime if we forget it. But on the whole, the Americans, the official American administration, didn't want that visit of Pelosi. As Isabel said, she imposed it herself. So I don't think we are heading really for a clash America-China directly. It's more an event in a very difficult relationship.
Isabel, Taiwan is the part of China where the nationalists fighting against the communists fled before the declaration of the People's Republic in 1949. But what is it about its status that matters so much to Beijing?
They've made it matter. And the story keeps changing. You know, it wasn't really part of China until the Qing dynasty, which is, the 17th century. And it was only part of China then. The Qing paid attention to it because the Ming resistance to the Qing invasion had to retreat to Taiwan. So poor Taiwan gets retreated to as a result of wars on the mainland. Yes. And then after that, it became a Japanese colony in 1895, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and it was returned to China in 1945 with the defeat of Japan. There was some resistance. There was an uprising in 1947 against the Chinese by the Taiwanese and a white terror, a massacre. Then in 1949, the nationalists lost the Civil War and, they turn up.
They retreat as well.
And declare themselves, the government of all China from Taiwan, and were recognized as such by the Americans until Nixon goes to China. So, it's been a complicated story, but when Taiwan won democracy, which it did after the dictatorship of the nationalists fell, after Chiang Kai-shek's death, the Taiwanese people, got out on the streets in the way that rising middle classes do and got a democratic system. And the Taiwanese identity, which is not the Chinese identity, emerged through democratic
and not
politics.
the American identity. This is the problem, isn't it? It's got two big powers fighting over not fighting, in dispute over this.
Yeah.
And perhaps sometimes Taiwan's voice doesn't get heard very much. I mean, it has guessed it didn't necessarily want to come, it has to accept.
And if you want to troll the Chinese on this, point out that Mao Zedong told Edgar Snow in Red Star Over China that he didn't regard Taiwan, which he called Formosa, as a part of China. He thought of it much more like Korea, which was also a Japanese colony, and that it was the duty of the Communist Party to help liberate Taiwan so it could be an independent country, along with Korea, so that could be an independent country. It wasn't considered then by the great founder of the Communist Party an integral part of China. This is a much more recent phenomenon, and it's part of it's a part of a national story. If you stop being an empire, which is a much more flexible arrangement, if you like, and you try to establish a nation state, borders become much more important. And so Xi Jinping's great gift to the Chinese people, as he presents it, is to recover the lost province.
Thank you all very much. Let's talk about the lady who did turn, Liz Truss, who had come up with this idea, Mark, of potentially regional pay rates. So if you have a job in a different part of the UK, basically if you're outside of London, then you shouldn't get as much as you would in London. Lots of companies have what they call London weighting to recognise extra costs, but they don't necessarily pay different amounts if they're national organisations, in different parts of the country. And public sectors don't pay different parts of the country. But she seemed to be attracted, and then she backed off quite quickly from the idea of having regional pay boards. Do you see any merit in that original idea? Is there an economic argument where there might be some merit in that?
Well, there's absolutely no merit. It's a stupid idea because the present system works very well where civil servants are paid the same wherever they are. You are serving the state, you are not serving a region. It's completely different, the local people. But anyway, that story which he retracts is completely dwarfed by the announcement and the cataclysmic announcement by the Bank of England about recession, about triple increase in energy bills, and about the cost of living in general, 13%. And this is absolutely leaving no room of maneuver to Liz Truss or to her adversary. Because basically, where will there be money to, as they want, diminish tax? Because they both want to diminish tax. She wants to diminish company tax, he wants to get rid of the energy VAT. But, you know, there's no money. So, unless you endebt more the country, which is already 100% of GDP, and then you threaten your AA rating, which means more money to pay, the only solution, which is not very conservative, is to increase tax and diminish public service, public expense, which you can't do at a time of recession. So whoever wins will be in a no-win situation.
Yasmin, just before we leave the point about kind of regional pay and that idea, why was it so politically toxic an idea?
Because this woman, Liz Truss, seems to be producing, ideas out of a Christmas cracker or something, hardly thought through at all. And then she spins and she changes. She was a Remainer and she became a Brexiter, and, she believes that, and then she doesn't believe it anymore. And it's actually quite embarrassing to watch her. I'm a feminist, and of course I would wish for a good woman to take over the party, but it is deeply embarrassing. She hasn't thought this thing through. And the other thing is, it's quite interesting, is in a letter in the FT today, which was fascinating because they keep saying this is a global thing, that out of the 10 most productive countries in the world, 7 or 8 of them are in the EU. And that when the UK was in the EU, it outshone all other countries. So there is a connection between what is going on with this inflationary pressures, recession and all of that, and a decision, in my view, that was badly taken. A lot of people are asking why we have 2 people who are standing for leader, just not addressing those core questions.
Isabel, I suppose the other point about it is that given the government's message in part has been about levelling up the country, this idea that you pay things different parts doesn't sit politically very well with that.
Absolutely not. And, if there is a problem with differential costs of living, as there is, for example, in London, there used to be a thing, and maybe it still exists, called the London waiting, where you get an extra allowance if you have to pay more for your daily. But the idea that you should figure out, that in Bolton you can pay people less than you can in Birmingham, as Mark says, they're working for the state. It's preposterous. What happens when they move? What happens when they get promoted? Anyway, but it's the kind of triviality of it that bothers me. This country seems to be staring over a cliff, and neither of them, frankly, seem to have very much to say about the very big issues.
And what they do have to say is it kind of got, certainly Liz Truss seemed to be on a bit of a collision course with the Bank of England, arguing that it's had the wrong response. A lot of Conservatives are very critical of the bank anyway, saying it didn't move fast enough against inflation a year ago. It's an independent body. It largely directs itself, its monetary policy committee. It's put up rates 0.5%. As it warned it would do. The Governor, Andrew Bailey, said today, though, on Friday rather, that in terms of what he had heard the criticism of, that it hadn't moved fast enough, he rejected that. And he also said its approach to buying assets this quantitative easing programme, which it argued had helped during the credit crunch, was not part of the problem. So in a sense, there's a political conflict opening up here between the woman most likely to become Prime Minister at the moment and the governor of the central bank.
And her reaction has been to suggest that she curtailed the independence of the Bank of England, which again is characteristic of this contest, that every time an independent body, be it the Electoral Commission or the Bank of England, produces a result that is inconvenient politically for the candidates, they suggest they can abolish, the very factors that make them valuable and make their advice trusted. So it's a very, very depressing prognosis, frankly.
And to agree with Yasmin, Brexit, they both are Brexiteers.
As you were, you thought it was something...
Yes, but I've turned now an arch Remainer when I see the result of it. The fact is that Brexit is making it very difficult to take advantage even of the devaluation of sterling, for instance. Sterling is at its weakest compared to the dollar.
And the argument has always been that that would help make us more competitive.
Absolutely, because imports are more expensive, so
we should be producing more stuff ourselves. Yeah.
But you don't take advantage of export being less expensive because of Brexit with your principal commercial partner is now full of obstacles and tariffs and administrative hindrance. So the situation is...
It's not just down to the British, it's partly down to the EU as well, isn't it? I mean, that's about the partnership.
Well, no, come on. The EU has done everything to ease the way for the British to have a good Brexit, but simply the
there will be quite a lot of people who take issue with that.
I know, they will say Macron is the worst anti-British, etc. The fact is that the British didn't have their act together, they were divided, and they treated Brussels, as Brexiters do, with utter contempt.
Okay,
which is
let's not kind of litigate that. But just in terms of where this leaves the UK now, Yasmin, I was reading an article by Melanie Phillips, who's a long-standing Conservative, a kind of commentator. And she was writing in an article this week that she kind of despaired of the Conservative Party, because she said it seems to become an argument about the size of the state and tax, this leadership election, without looking at some of the bigger issues. What she talked of, a fracturing nation and priceless principles she thinks now in danger of being lost forever. The party no longer understands what conservatism really was, she wrote in the Times this week.
Yes, well, I'm sorry. You're asking the wrong person here to give any serious consideration to what Melanie Phillips thinks of the
But what
world.
about that point about the argument that the parties...
that the French Revolution was about upholding Western values. That, of course, this is what Burke used to say.
Yes, it's a traditional Conservative view.
The Tory party to uphold British values. And that we should say nothing but how great our history was. It's all this woke stuff that she's going on about. What's interesting, though, in it, she feels that Kemi Badenoch, a black woman, articulates that kind of, in my view, fake national pride better than Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss. This is quite interesting. But I can't take that seriously at all, I'm sorry.
What about the argument that there's something about this debate, though, Isabel, that it's become too narrow, and that, in a sense, it's not just for the Conservative Party, but for the public as well, since, after all, this is the debate which will help determine who is Prime Minister? Well,
indeed, Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom, I might point out. And I haven't read Melanie's article, but it seems to me that since the One Nation Tories were expelled by Boris Johnson for not supporting Brexit, what we have is, instead of the Conservative and Unionist Party, we have an English National Party. The remarks that Liz Truss made about the leader of the Scottish Parliament this week were, frankly, shocking. You can't just ignore, you can't just accuse her, a serious politician, of being attention-seeking and saying you're going to ignore her. The SNP has repeatedly been voted into power by the Scottish people. What does that say to the Scottish people? It says there's no future for us, with a Liz Truss England. They're playing fast and loose with Northern Ireland. This is certainly not the Conservative Party as it was.
Very briefly, Mark.
Well, I find extraordinary for the foreign world that the next Prime Minister is chosen by 160,000 people, completely unrepresentative of the country, which England is.
Mark Roche, Isabel Hilton and Yasmin Al-Brown, thank you all very much. Get well soon to your family member, Yasmin, and we'll see you back in the studio. And we'll see you again, same time next week from Dateline. Goodbye.